Hey guys, welcome back. I'm in the kitchen with Dr. Bill Schindler here, the author of Eat Like a Human. We're at his restaurant, Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which is amazing. We're going to talk all about grains and understand the differences between how ancient humans consumed and prepared grains to make them more bioavailable, to reduce the anti-nutrient content, and so that they taste better. So, Bill, I think many of your customers, like myself, had avoided eating bread or any grain products for years. I mean, we would buy almond flour tortillas or gluten-free flour. Since I read your book, Eat Like a Human, I am now making sourdough bread at home, sourdough pancakes, sourdough pizza. My family is loving it. All my friends want to come over. Gluten-sensitive friends, I was telling you offline last night, they can eat the bread and the pizza and have no issues with that because of the fermentation process. So that's what I want to focus in on. And then also do's and don'ts when it comes to buying grains at the store. There's enriched flour, which we should avoid. But how does the sourdough process make a grain, wheat like this, more accessible and reduce the anti-nutrients?
So one thing we need to understand, first off, is we have had grains in our diets literally forever. And a lot of those grains were at very low levels in our diets. Wild grains are very hard to get in large amounts and to process in large amounts. So it's at a very low level in our diet. But when we hit the agricultural revolution between 12 and 15,000 years ago, we had a huge influx of grains. Not that that necessarily is a good thing, but what we were doing with our grains then is completely different than what we're doing with most of our grains today. And that sourdough process is essential. So all bread, and everybody needs to 100% recognize this. Every loaf of bread baked anywhere in the world up until the mid-1800s was sourdough. By default, it was sourdough. And when I say sourdough, I mean to make that bread, there's two simultaneous fermentations taking place. One is a yeast fermentation and one is a bacterial fermentation. To be truly sourdough, it has to have both. Now, most breads today are yeasted breads, which we're taking yeast that comes out of a factory, we put it in, it produces carbon dioxide, the bread rises. And it might look good, it might taste good, but it's a different food and our bodies deal with it differently. So every single loaf of bread for thousands of years was completely sourdough by default. And as a side note, every bottle, jar, jug of beer ever made for thousands of years was a sour beer until the mid-1800s as well, which that's a whole other topic. But it is at least, it had that simultaneous fermentation. The yeast fermentation creates carbon dioxide and alcohol. If we're making alcohol, we care about the alcohol. We're making bread, we only care about the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide makes the bread rise. The yeast does nothing else besides that. Any safety that comes from the fermentation process, any bioavailability that's increased because of that process, any aroma, any flavor, all of those wonderful things that we love about bread comes from the bacterial fermentation, which is missing in almost every loaf of bread today.
Because the labor that it takes to have the bulk fermentation process, so most bakers are just throwing in yeast to accelerate the process. Is that mostly why?
It's a faster process in many cases, but also it is more controllable, especially on a mass scale. So it's easier to just say, hey, I'm going to measure out this exact amount of yeast. I know every strain of yeast coming out of that factory has, exactly the same amount of microbes in it, and they work at this rate, at this temperature. And you can automate much of that process, and you can have people that become more factory workers than actually artisans.
Right.
But the sourdough process is just as controllable if you understand the finer pieces of it. As a side note, our bread, we refresh our mother for 12 to 16 hours, and then our bread continues to ferment over, it depends on the bread, but many, many, many hours later. Sometimes our bread is made in a day and a half, sometimes it's made over 3 days, but that is a very long process. And during that time, all the beautiful things about bread are created through that bacterial fermentation. Wonder bread is made in 1 hour. From flour getting measured to everything getting mixed under high velocity, baked, cooled down, sliced, and put into a bag 1 hour start to finish. It is a completely different food.
Which is why the glycemic index is pretty high on Wonder bread and white bread. In contrast, the sourdough process lowers the glycemic index.
Yes, because remember, both the yeast and the bacteria are eating the available sugars. So you have two literally colonies or populations of bacteria and yeast that are eating all that available sugar, and it's not available to us at that point. So the glycemic index is much lower. In fact, if you took any loaf of yeasted bread, I don't care if it's Wonder bread made out of white flour or next door to the Petridge farm with the wheat berries and all the other things, I don't care what kind of bread it is, yeasted bread is always in the higher range in the glycemic index. And by taking the same ingredients and putting it through the sourdough process, it drops through the middle range down into the low range.
Which is awesome. And we have both verified this. You were wearing a continuous glucose monitor, had a Belgian waffle that was made via the sourdough process. It didn't bump you. I mean, it was a little bit of a bump, but it wasn't a huge
gradual increase, a nice recovery. It was beautiful, exactly what it should be.
Right. In contrast, you had an acai bowl later that day, and it was just a skyrocket.
Spiked. I mean, it scared me how high it spiked.
Right. And people eat acai bowls all day long and don't think twice about it.
Now, this segment with Dr. Bill Schindler is brought to you by the good folks over at Maui Nui Venison.com, the makers of the most nutrient-dense red meat on the planet. This is wild, axis-deer meat that you can get delivered directly to your home. If you want to start out with their venison sticks, I would highly recommend doing that. They also have the venison sticks with organ meats like liver, heart, spleen, and kidney. Now, this red meat is really unique because it has amongst the highest protein to calorie ratio and among the best omega-6 to omega-3 fat ratio compared to other red meats out there. Plus, it's very dense in antioxidants, micronutrients, polyphenols, as well as other vitamins and minerals. It's really, really tasty. We rely upon this, especially when we travel. My daughter's an athlete, and so I like to bring the venison sticks with me on the road for her track meets. We're talking regionals, nationals, associations, and beyond, because it's hard to get high quality protein on the road. So if you travel a lot and you have children and you're trying to get them to eat higher quality protein, it's really hard to get kids to eat protein, as you know. Definitely check out MauiNuiVenison.com/Hites to save. The sticks are amazing. Your kids will love them. Nutrient dense, antioxidant rich, highest protein to calorie ratio compared to any other meat out there. It's phenomenal. I think you'll really enjoy it.
So one thing I wanted to mention very quickly, because the anti-nutrients and the phytates and the all the craziness that's on those grains are a real problem for humans.
Yeah.
In fact, grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes are chemically and physically designed to actually withstand the digestive tract of animals. I mean, they're the next generation. Their job is to go through an animal and come out the other end. And in fact, some require, through a process called scarification, going through the digestive tract of an animal in order to be able to germinate on the other end. But here we are doing a very weird thing. We're trying to get nutrition by eating this thing that's designed. I mean, it's no surprise that a seed, like think about a watermelon seed, it looks like a bullet because it's so shoot right through us. It is chemically and physically protected. So here's a quick example of, and I'll do it very quickly, but I think it's a powerful one. So at a very superficial, I know I'm going to get destroyed online from this biologist, but at a very superficial level, this egg and these wheat berries have some similarities. So one is they're the next generation of the organisms that produce them. Right? They're the babies. They're not here for us to eat. They're there to produce a baby chicken and a new wheat plant. They also have three major parts to them. This has a shell, a white, and a yolk. And this has the bran on the outside, the endosperm on the inside, and then the germ that's in there as well. The yolk here and the germ there are the new babies, right? And they are, from a nutritional perspective, they pack the biggest punch. But from a protection level, this shell is here to protect it, and that bran is there to protect that grain. Now, that's kind of where the similarities run out. Let's talk about some differences. If this egg was fertilized, in the chicken and came out.
If there was a rooster with a hen.
If there was a rooster and a hen, and this thing was fertilized. This is not, but let's pretend it is. I could take this away from the chicken, sit it literally on this table in this temperature, this humidity, and it would stay viable for about a week to 10 days before I'd have to stick it back under that chicken, and then it would actually produce chicken still. Beyond that, it wouldn't be viable any longer. This grain, which is essentially fertilized through the reproductive process of the plant, this is a fertilized grain waiting to be in the right environment. I could put this on this counter, and guess how long that would stay viable for still? In other words, how long could it sit here before I had to put it in the ground to produce a new plant?
I'm going to guess a year? A long time.
So up until about a month ago, I would have told you, it's thousands of years, because we have maize from an archaeological site in New York State that's thousands of years old that we were able to put into the ground, plant, germinate, and it's still, I think it's in the botanical gardens in BC, so thousands of years.
Okay.
But they just found a squirrel that dates to, I think, 38,000 years ago. He ate a seed of this one flower, died. They dug him up, found him. 38,000 years old, they were able to germinate that seed.
Wow.
38,000 years. I think about the squirrel from Ice Age when I think about him. So it's probably a very similar time period.
Yeah.
What's the difference? Well, the difference is this egg, although there's some chemical things going on, primarily this is protected by the shell physically. That's it. This is protected by a massive amount of anti-nutrients, all sorts of nasty chemicals on the outside of that grain that keeps this dormant. The sole purpose is to keep that dormant until it's in the right environment that it can produce new life. And when it gets in that right environment, it lets down its defenses. It can't sprout until it lets down its defenses. And so part of things like the phytates actually turn into nutrients that nourish it. Some of the other anti-nutrients actually just disable and allow that thing to actually sprout. So what we need to do is disable the nastiness on the outside of those grains in order for our body to safely and more efficiently derive nutrition from those grains. If I took this grain, what happens nowadays is a farmer plants this, it grows in a wheat plant, it gets mature. Typically nowadays we throw Roundup on it so that it kills it, dries it, and then we harvest it. Whether the Roundup or not is in there, we still take it dry, keep it dry, store it dry, grind it dry, mix it up real quick and try to make bread. We've done nothing to detoxify the anti-nutrients on the outside of this. And we didn't even get to the gluten. The sourdough process does that.
Okay. Let's talk about the anti-nutrients and the detoxification process. So it's that microbial or bacterial fermentation that would help detoxify. Isn't there a phytase enzyme within the mother culture that will break down?
Yeah, there's several different things that are happening at the same time.
Okay.
Some of them are chemical, some of them are physical. So the bacterial, again, the yeast fermentation makes the bread rise. Other than that, we don't need to worry about it. The bacterial fermentation does several things. One is it is dropping the pH. So as it's eating the available sugars, it's producing lactic acid the same way it does when you make sauerkraut, the same way it does when you ferment and make yogurt. It's producing lactic acid and that pH is dropping. The pH, and I need everybody to understand this, the pH has to drop below 4.6 in order to activate a protease enzyme that really starts to work on the gluten primarily. So that protease enzyme gets activated at 4.6, and then it starts chopping up the gluten and making it more digestible. There's obviously a lot of other things happening at the same time, but that's a really important one because you need to make sure that you've reached that. Now, I don't expect everybody at home to get a pH meter to make bread. If you have a normal hydration bread, regular sourdough bread recipe, and it's fermenting at some point at room temperature for at least 3 hours, you've reached that 4.6. That's fine.
That's awesome. But those meters, if one wanted to really get into this, are helpful.
Incredibly helpful.
We've showed some B-roll of that.
Yeah, we've done a bunch of stuff already with it in past days. Here we use it at the shop all the time, and there you can get $30. You can get a pH meter that you use at your house, and it works great.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So real quick with that fermentation, so you have the gluten getting chopped up. You have through both the fermentation, through the chemical part of the fermentation and the physical things that are happening, you're getting the outside of those grains to detoxify. You're also pre-digesting this grain to make your body work less hard to access the nutrients on the inside.
Right. And I think that's another thing that I would love to talk about, accessing the nutrients. So when we think about grains, we kind of put them in the same category as seed oils and soy and all that because people think, oh my gosh, all the anti-nutrients. But there is good nutrition in grain, right? I mean, we talk about zinc and folate and iron and B vitamins. So making those micronutrients more accessible to us is behooves us. And that's why we might want to consider this. So let's talk about some of the good nutrition in a whole grain like that.
And I'll also say with that, it's a great point. I'll also say these grains, if you take this grain and try to eat it right now, you would make yourself very sick.
Yeah.
You would get, not only wouldn't you get much nutrition from it, but the anti-nutrients and that would be robbing your body of nutrients of either things you're eating at the same time as it or things that, the nutrients that are already in your body. It is a negative end product by eating this like it is now. Going through that fermentation process, not only are you releasing those nutrients and making them available, but you're making them available even easier. But we do also need to remember that the nutrients, most of the nutrients are actually in the germ of this. So from a nutritional perspective, it makes sense to use whole wheat flour.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you a very quick story. When we first opened up the bakery, this has happened, I swear to you, I'm not making any of this up. The first week we were open, we had 3 women come 3 different days, literally one after the other, and they all shared their opinion of our product. And they all had different opinions, but I think this is very telling. The first one came in and she says, hey, do you have any 100% whole grain bread? And we didn't. At the time, we were mixing our flours, and we had some white, some whole wheat. And I said, no, it's a mixture, but it's through this powerful sourdough process. She goes, I don't care. How do you call yourself a place that's built around health, and it's not 100% whole grain? And she left. The next day, another woman came in, And she said the same exact thing. And I told her the whole story, and she didn't want to hear it, and she left. The third day, a woman comes in, and she says, hey, do you have any 100% white flour sourdough bread? Jeez. And I said, no, we mix it all. And she's same kind of reaction. Like, how do you call yourself a place that's built around health and promoting health, and you don't have any 100% white flour? And it sounds like how are these people even, from different ends of the spectrum? Well, they all were looking for something different. The first two women were looking for the most amount of nutrition they can get, and they realized that the nutrition is in the germ, and if you're somebody that wants fiber in your diet, the fiber's in the bran. And it wasn't in there at the level they wanted it. The third woman has major gut issues with flour and was looking for the least amount of anti-nutrients that are there. And again, because most of the toxins are on the outside of that grain because it's protecting that grain, her solution was to go after 100% white flour. And I get, they're looking for something different.
Right. But the point here is that the sourdough fermentation process takes care of all that.
Yeah, it helps. Yeah, very much so. There's all sorts of issues with grains, and we don't have time to get into. We get into things like, okay, how much glyphosate is on your flour? How much genetic modification has gone into some grains today, and all those issues with that. But the power, and all that is important. The power comes from this ancient process of controlling a natural, really rotting process, to take these grains and turn them into their safest and most nourishing forms possible. That fermentation process works wonders. We had a massive amount of gluten-intolerant customers that are fine on our bread, and we have 8 confirmed medically diagnosed celiac customers that are fine on our bread.
That's amazing. Yeah, I was doing some research on the sourdough fermentation process, and pretty much every continent in the world has evidence that this was going on, whether it was with wheat or buckwheat or with rice or tempeh or beans, legumes, mung beans. The fermentation is key to making, plant-based grain products more bioavailable, which I think is fascinating. So let's talk about what grains should people be buying for. I like einkorn and locally grown wheat in Washington State, within a 100-mile radius of where I live. What flours do you recommend people buy?
It depends on what you're looking for. So if you don't have an issue with gluten, or you're at a level of celiac that the sourdough fermentation process makes it safe enough for you, which for many people it does, then using wheat is easy. Yeah. Because sometimes people are looking for that health or getting away from the gluten, but sometimes people are looking for a bread that just is as nourishing as it can be, and it looks and tastes the right way, and their kids are eating it as opposed to Wonder Bread, and that's enough for them. So wheat is great. I will tell you, I love spelt and I love kamut. They are both, if you're trying to step away from modern wheat into something that acts like wheat, but is a little more ancestral, a little more traditional, and a little bit healthier, then those two are great. They're absolutely fantastic. I love rye. I love rye. Rye has a distinctive flavor. It ferments really, really well, and everything about it, the color, the flavor, the texture, all of it is fantastic.
I've had a hard time with rye. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Well, yeah, and actually, it ferments really well, but it ferments really fast, and that's one of the problems. The bacteria love it, so we have to change a couple things with it.
Okay. It seemed to get really sticky and stuck to everything.
Oh, it's stuck.
Yeah.
Your hands have to be soaking wet to work with it.
Very interesting. So I think there's a certain percentage of people that are watching this video that say, you know what, this sounds complex. I'm going to go with the gluten-free bread, almond flour-based bread. Why should we not consider that? Or what are the potential consequences or downsides to having all these almond breads?
Well, it's important to understand that if you move away from a gluten-containing grain and go to a gluten-free flour, the only thing you're getting rid of is the gluten. You still have all the anti-nutrients. You still have all those other issues that fermentation takes care of, or at least helps mitigate. So one of the rules here in our house and also here at the shop is that any single flour that we use in any product goes through the long, wild, slow fermentation process. It has to. So even if you decide to do this all gluten-free, you still need. It makes sense to put it through that process. Plus, most gluten-free flours are complete junk.
Yeah.
So I would never use almond flour ever, especially because of the oxalates. But there's a lot of if you're making decisions about your diet based on nutritional reasons, then I wouldn't use almond flour because of the oxalates. If you're making decisions about sustainability, then I would use almond flour because of a ton of reasons as well. So almond flour's out 100%. Potato flour's out for me. Loaded with toxins, loaded with oxalates, that's out. We use oat flour, we use rice flour, we use tapioca flour or starch. It's the same thing. But with potato starch is a different thing than potato flour. Potato starch doesn't have the toxins in it potato flour has. So our gluten-free mixture is usually a combination of those. It works really well. We still put it through that process, but we're starting with a much lower toxin load in that mixture.
So the mother culture would be a rice flour base, or?
Yep, we keep our gluten-free mother. We started it with rice flour, and we keep it going with rice flour.
So you feed it just like you would wheat flour.
Exact same recipe, but we replace the wheat flour with the rice flour.
Interesting. But in your opinion, because there's a lot of gluten-sensitive people that are fine consuming your fermented, gluten-containing grains, probably not necessary. But if they wanted to do that, they could.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we cater to that. We are not a gluten-free facility, so there's flour in the air. And somebody comes in, our bakery, as you saw, is in the middle of the restaurant. So somebody coming in, we've had people come in, hey, I need this gluten-free whatever. And I say, we have gluten-free. I just want to let you know we're not a gluten-free facility. And they're standing there all upset. And they're breathing in gluten. It's the flour's in the air. But we can't guarantee that. But we still, again, that most important part is that fermentation. So for most people that come in here, they are absolutely fine on our bread because we've put it through that process. But it has to be a genuine fermentation process.
Right. So along those lines, do you think all the fear about avoiding gluten is a little bit overhyped, especially considering what the fermentation process does to the gluten?
Absolutely. And I'm not trying to discount anybody who has severe gluten allergies. I mean, there is really something to that for sure. Yeah. But I think a lot of it's getting hyped to the point that it's become a scapegoat. Anybody who eats bread at all and doesn't feel well automatically says, "Well, I'm gluten intolerant." And look, celiac is a real thing. Gluten intolerance is a real thing. It's become a scapegoat, and it could be a number of a million different things. One is almost every loaf of bread at the grocery store that says it's sourdough is not sourdough. It has not gone through that bacterial fermentation. Almost any restaurant you go to and you order the sourdough bun on your hamburger, it is not sourdough.
Yeah.
There's no regulation in this country whatsoever. No standards you have to meet to call something sourdough. I could call that egg sourdough and I'd be absolutely fine.
That's insane.
It's insane. So you need to make sure that it's gone through that bacterial fermentation. And the best way to make sure is to make the bread yourself. And the second best way is to go to a bakery where you're actually talking to the baker or you're one person away from the baker and say, hey, tell me how you make this bread.
And what questions would someone ask? Because there is a bakery, I've been to several bakeries who I thought were making traditional sourdough. What would you ask? You would ask, how long is our fermentation time and are you using yeast?
I would ask, how long is your fermentation time at room temperature? Because when you take the dough and stick it in the refrigerator, you slow down the yeast and you shut down the bacteria. And remember, the bacteria is the important part. So if you could do this, and in fact, I wrote about this in my book before I understood this, and it's one thing I'm going to change in the next edition, but this is what I could do. I could, if I was I worked a 40-hour-a-week job and I really wanted to make bread regularly for my family, and I didn't have time to do it on the weekends because of soccer practice and all that with the kids. I could get up in the morning on Monday, refresh my mother, come back from work on Monday night, mix the bread, and then put the dough directly in the refrigerator.
Yeah.
Get up Tuesday morning, take that, divide it, pre-shape it, put it in baskets, shape it, put it in baskets, put it in the fridge, and come back Tuesday night, take it right out of the refrigerator and stick it in the oven. And I could have something that looked like a gorgeous loaf of bread if I timed it right. But it isn't sourdough. Even if sourdough mother's in it, I can't call it sourdough because the bacteria wasn't in the right environment long enough to actually ferment and transform that flour. So I would ask, number one, how long does this bread stay at room temperature when it's bulk fermenting or fermenting at all? And it needs to be at least 3 hours to do it. Secondly, there's a lot of sourdough bakers, actually many sourdough bakers, that do add yeast to their sourdough. Now, that isn't necessarily bad. We don't do it. We're very traditional in the way that we do it. But they add it just to get a little bit of an extra lift and make it a little more, it's easier to make it more regular and standard that way. But the problem is some people are actually allergic to yeast, and we find some of our customers are allergic to commercial yeast. So adding that yeast, though, still the bacterial fermentation is still happening. So you still could get something with the same health benefits if there's a little bit of pinch of yeast added. It's not the end of the world. What is the end of the world is if you look at the ingredients, and if they add anything acidic, if they add lactic acid or citric acid or acetic acid, which is vinegar, if they add that in, what they're trying to do is fool us by,
taste sour.
Yeah, we think it's supposed to taste sour, right? We have this misconception that sourdough is supposed to taste sour. They're making a yeasted bread, and delivering us something that meets our expectations, but it is just a yeasted bread and it's no better than Wonder Bread. That's the thing you look for at the grocery stores.
Okay. Under the other ingredients, it might say those things if it wasn't a traditional sourdough fermentation process.
Sourdough bread, real genuine traditional bread, requires fire, water, salt. That's it. And then trillions of wild bacteria and yeast. If there is anything that says yeast added, I would be cautious and skeptical. If there's anything that says anything acidic in it, I would turn around and put it right back.
Yeah, don't even deal with it. My final question here is there's a lot of talk about the gut microbiome and a healthy gut and bacterial diversity. I know that when we're cooking the bread, we're making waffles or sourdough pizza crust, right? We're cooking at a high temperature. Are we getting any bacterial DNA, do you think, from that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I have seen a few studies that suggest even though the bacteria is dead when we're eating it, that we do get some benefits from it. I don't know enough to answer that, but I will, and I'm not skirting the question, but I will add something that's even more beautiful, I think. There was a study done several years ago where they were trying to see if the scientists went and got loaves of bread from these different bakeries around the world, if they could then look at them under a microscope, and even though the bacteria were dead, look at the bacteria and yeast, the colonies of all bacteria and yeast that's in the final bread, and see if they could go then and identify what bakery it came from. In other words, is the local colonies of bacteria and yeast different enough in these different areas that they could identify the bread that way, and they could.
Whoa.
What they found, which is even more beautiful, is that they could identify the baker.
Wow.
That the bacteria that's naturally on the baker's hands, bacteria and yeast that are there, impacted the microflora that went into the bread, and that relationship was symbiotic. The bread also impacted the microflora on the skin of the bakers.
Whoa.
Now, that's a beautiful thing.
That is super
That's
cool.
connecting with your food on a level that,
Yeah.
blow your mind.
And that's what we're trying to do here, and make it eat closer to home and be a part of the cooking process. That's so many people are just eating out or ordering on Uber Eats or Instacart. So, I fell in love with the process thanks to your book, Eat Like a Human. So I definitely recommend everyone check this out. I'll put this in the link in the description below. If folks want to connect with you, Bill, what's the best way to do that?
A couple ways to do that. So our website is modernstonage.com, and I'm on Instagram at Dr. Bill Schindler, at Dr. Bill Schindler, and also at the Modern Stone Age.
Amazing, which is where we are now. I highly recommend if you're on the East Coast, come check it out, just east of Baltimore.
Yep, we're only about an hour and a half from D.C., hour and a half from Philly, and a few hours from New York City.
Amazing. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.